the second part of the cardiovascular system discussion. So in this discussion, we'll be finishing up bacterial diseases that impact the cardiovascular system, Lyme's, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and then typhus and some other spotted fevers as well. And then we're going to continue into the second lecture, which is going to be cardiovascular diseases caused by viruses, fungus, and protozoa. All right, so first up is plague. This is bubonic plague or black plague, kind of like that ancestral, thinking about medieval Europe. The causative agent of plague is actually a bacteria. The bacteria is called Yersinia pestis. It's a gram-negative rod. And so how people actually contract this disease is from fleas that are going to take they're going to transmit. So a flea will bite someone who's infected, take the bacteria, and then the bacteria will live inside of the flea, and then the flea bites somebody else. And so that's how the disease is usually transmitted. Okay, animals that serve as reservoirs for the bacteria. So the bacteria are going to grow inside of rats, like when we think about medieval Europe and the bubonic plague. Prairie dogs now in the U.S. are actually reservoirs for this bacteria. So there are still cases of black plague or bubonic plague currently occurring in the United States, and they're from people coming into contact with fleas that have recently bitten prairie dogs. Okay, so bubonic plague and septicemia plague and pneumonic plague are all forms of the same infection. Bubonic plague is specifically when the bacteria grow in the blood and lymphatic fluid. When the blood and lymph bacteria, when it goes body-wide, it becomes, you get septicemic shock, and this is ultimately what kills you. And it is also possible to have the bacteria cause a lung infection, which is very serious, upwards to 100% mortality. The name bubonic plague is actually talking about buboes that form. So this is what occurs when lymph nodes, so in this case these are inguinal lymph nodes or lymph nodes of the groin that have become really, really swollen, and they start to become necrotic with these red rings. So like the little kids poem like Ring Around the Rosie is describing the buboes that form as a result of this bacterial infection. Okay, so again, there are still cases of bubonic plague that get diagnosed in the United States, and if you were to look at prairie dog colonies that test positive, they're going to be around this area. So people are getting this disease because they're exposed to fleas that have been in contact with the prairie dogs. Cases that are a little bit further away, it is possible that dogs can be bit by fleas that were previously attached to prairie dogs, and then the dog gets fleas, and then you get bit by the dog flea, so it is possible to also get it that way as well. All right, so switching diseases now. We're leaving bubonic plague behind, and we're talking about Lyme's disease. Lyme's is actually named for the city that it was first discovered in, but it is prevalent throughout the East Coast. Lyme's is caused by a bacteria, another B bacteria for you guys keeping track. This guy is Borrelia burgdorferi. This guy is unique and different because he is a spirochete or spiral shaped. So you see the spiral shape here. So the reservoir are going to be deer and mice. So again, what's happening with that is that the deer have the bacteria initially, and then, or mice, and then ticks will bite the mice, and then it grows in the ticks, so the ticks are transmitting it from the mice to to a human. And so that's how you get Lyme's disease. So it's not directly from the deer or the mice. You use this vector or this intermediate, which are the deer ticks. The ticks that carry Lyme's can be very small. So here's the head of a pin, very small. So often they'll tell you when you're bit by a tick, you should save it so that they can, potentially identify what you've been exposed to. But for the most part, if you've, been in the woods, they're going to, have Lyme's as a potential list. All right, so not every case of Lyme's is going to develop this bullseye rash. So you can see here, right, so the tick was likely attached here, and then you get these rings forming around the initial bite, so it kind of looks like a bullseye. This is hallmark Lyme's, the bullseye rash, but again, not every case of Lyme's have we been able to identify the bullseye rash. So it's not present in all cases, but it's a good indicator that you've been exposed if you develop it. All right, so initial symptoms are this skin rash, and then if left untreated, right, if you don't notice the tick bite and never see the rash, it is possible to develop a whole bunch of weird symptoms: irregular heartbeat, encephalitis, flu-like symptoms, arthritis, as a result of the bacterial infection. The irregular heartbeat and encephalitis are caused by damage from the bacteria, and the arthritis is actually caused by your immune system activation. So, right, your immune system realizes there's a threat, starts to attack the bacteria, and then becomes overreactive, and that results in arthritis, or attacking the joints, flu-like symptoms as a result. And the arthritis is really difficult to treat, so at this point antibiotics may not be effective, because what's causing the arthritis isn't the bacteria, it's your body's immune response to the presence of the bacteria. And again, those antibodies are going to be present whether or not the bacteria is there. Here's the map I was telling you about in class. Again, I think we're like right here. So again, right, I think both of my dogs had Lyme's. Going out in the woods, certain times of the year drastically increases your exposure. There was previously a vaccine available for Lyme's, but it wasn't very effective, so it was taken off the market. And I think they're still developing the best prophylactics you can use, because there is currently no vaccine, is just to wear appropriate clothing and avoid or reduce your risk of being exposed to a tick. So this is the actual life cycle of the Lyme's disease vector. So if we start over here, right, so we have a mouse, and the mouse is going to have the bacteria present. The mouse is bit by a larval tick, so that when the ticks are born, they are uninfected, so they don't have bacteria. But when the tick bites the mouse, now this tick is carrying bacteria. And as he matures and grows, the second year, this guy has bacteria present. And then he bites you or bites your dog, and then that is how you or your dog then pick up the bacteria. Deer ticks are typically looking to get deer, but every once in a while humans, dogs become, infected accidentally. All right, so that's it for Lyme's. Moving on now to typhus. Typhus is caused by a group of bacteria called Rickettsia. There's a couple different species of Rickettsia we're going to discuss, but all of them have some features that are similar. They're all obligate intracellular parasites, so even though they're bacteria, this means that they have to live inside a host cell in order to replicate. They're missing some key components in order to be able to replicate themselves, but they're still considered bacteria because of their cell wall and genome makeup. The cells that they choose to infect are the endothelial cells of the vascular system. So these are going to be the inside of your blood vessels. And what happens there is when they infect the inside of the blood vessels, they damage those cells, and then the blood vessels become leaky. So we'll see a lot of these will have a rash associated with them. And all of the rickettsias are going to be transmitted to humans by arthropod vectors. So that means insects transmit the disease to people. Specifically when we're talking about typhus, we're talking about ticks, but we'll see there's some other insects that can transmit different types of this rickettsia bacteria. Okay, all right, so we have epidemic typhus, which is caused by Rickettsia prowazekii. This bacteria is commonly found in mice and rats, and it's transmitted to humans because body lice will bite the rodents and then bite you. Because we have body lice as the vector, usually we find epidemic typhus in low-income areas that where people don't have access to a lot of, sanitation. They're not showering regularly, kind of large homeless populations. There's a potential for this epidemic typhus. And the name epidemic is telling you how it usually presents in a population. So you'll have this group of, let's say, like homeless people wandering around in an area of the city, and you'll see no cases, and then you'll see like, oh my gosh, all the homeless people got it, and then it goes back down. So this kind of trend for the spread is considered an epidemic. So that's describing how it usually is transmitted. And it's interesting, it's with this body lice, it's actually it's not in the saliva of the lice, but what happens is it's going to, right, so if like this is your hand, whoops, okay, let's pretend like that's a hand, the lice is going to bite you, make a little hole, and then it poops next to it, and then it rubs the poop in the hole, and that is how you're contaminated, because in the poop is the bacteria. So isn't that fun? So again, proper hygiene, sanitation is going to drastically eliminate the potential for this type of typhus. Endemic typhus, endemic murine typhus. Murine means mouse. So this is transmitted at low levels throughout the population. Rickettsia typhi. Think about typhus, typhi. That's this name. Fleas transmit this from the mice. So again, if you're living in an area that doesn't have mice, doesn't have fleas, your risk is pretty low. And endemic means kind of constant level of transmission over time. All right, also caused by a rickettsia. This one was so nice they named it twice. So Rickettsia rickettsii is the bacteria that causes Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And even though the term is Rocky Mountain, that's just where this condition was initially diagnosed, we do have cases of Rocky Mountain spotted fever here on the East Coast. It causes a measles-like rash, and usually for measles, you do not get measles on the palms of your hands or the soles of your feet, but with Rocky Mountain spotted fever, you get the rash there. So here, if you were to flip this guy's feet over, you would see the rash on the bottom of his feet as well. So that's one of the ways we can tell this is not measles, but Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And what's happening here, the picture of this rash, all of these little bumps here, or these little, they're not freckles. These are actually, this is blood leaking out of his capillaries. And the capillaries are leaky because the bacteria have infected those cells lining the inner surface, and they're causing them not to stick together quite as nicely, so blood is leaking out. Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Usually you get flu-like symptoms with this as well, and a few days after the flu-like symptoms you have this funky rash, and often on the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet you get blisters that form as the skin kind of sloughs off. So again, even though it's called, the Rocky Mountains are over here, Blue Mountains, we do get cases every year in our area as well. So if you're bitten by a tick and you don't get Lyme's, there's a potential that you've exposed yourself to Rocky Mountain spotted fever, because both of those are transmitted by ticks to people. This is just showing the life cycle of Rocky Mountain spotted fever. So, again, rodent reservoirs, so the rabbit is positive for the bacteria. The baby tick will bite the rabbit, and then the adult bites the human, and that's how it's transmitted. All right, so those are our bacterial infections of the cardiovascular system. So in here, before I start the next lecture, again, I said this in class, but I just want to say it again. Please make sure when you're studying to really try and differentiate between the bacteria that begin with a B, right? Because we have Borrelia, we had Brucella, we had Bacillus, Bartonella. So again, on a multiple choice test, just make sure when you're trying to select the bacteria that causes the disease, that you're selecting the right one that begins with the letter B, because there's quite a few. Okay. All right. Now for the second part of the lecture. This card. All right. So this guy, we're done with this one. Time for viral protozoan diseases and helminth. So helminths, again, are parasitic worms. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and begin. Burkitt's lymphoma, infectious mononucleosis, cytomegalovirus, yellow fever. These are all hemorrhagic fevers, dengue, chikungunya, and Ebola. So lots of fun stuff headed our way. All right, Burkitt's lymphoma, I gotta be honest, I'm not gonna focus, probably any exam questions are gonna be on this, but Epstein-Barr virus, we are gonna talk about quite a bit. Epstein-Barr virus is a type of herpes virus, and so more commonly, so if you have a poor functioning immune system, so like malaria or AIDS, so something else that's compromising your immune system, and you get this viral infection, it can cause cancer. Usually we see this in sub-Saharan Africa, this certain type of cancer, Burkitt's lymphoma. In the U.S., when someone becomes infected with Epstein-Barr virus and they have symptoms associated with that, it's going to be more likely than not mono. Infectious mononucleosis, otherwise known as mono. It's caused by infections with the Epstein-Barr virus. It infects cells of the immune system. It's transmitted via saliva, and most people who are infected are asymptomatic. So it's possible for you to get infected with this virus and not have any symptoms. However, if you have a slightly overactive immune system, let's say you're more likely to have allergies or something of that nature, you're more likely to develop symptoms of mono. The other thing that makes you more likely to develop symptoms of mono is the age at which you're exposed. So it turns out if you're exposed really young, you tend not to develop symptoms. If you're exposed kind of in the early teenage years, you get mono if you have that overactive immune system. But so those are the two things. So your immune system, if it's a little too spicy, and also your age. If you're a little bit older, like preteen, teenage years when you're first exposed, you're more likely to develop symptoms of mono. Symptoms of mono: fever, extreme fatigue, sore throat, and swollen lymph nodes, swollen cervical lymph nodes. And when you're experiencing these symptoms, you're considered highly contagious, so it's best to stay home and rest rather than expose others. What else did I want to say about mono? You often have a swollen spleen as well, so you might have heard in the news like, oh, someone was recovering from mono, they're a football player, they went back, they got tackled, spleen ruptured, they died. So you just want to make sure that you're avoiding contact sports because of the potential splenomegaly and transmitted through saliva. So, it doesn't have to be kissing somebody, you can share drinks or something like that. So, but usually around the preteen years is when you start dabbling into that, so we see transmission rates increase. Cytomegalovirus, or CMV, is another type of herpes virus. There's a bunch of them. What happens is the infected cells, the cells that are infected with this virus, swell up. So that's what the term cytomegalovirus, it's describing what it does to the cells. It infects your white blood cells, and most of the time you have no idea you've been infected. There's no symptoms associated with this viral infection. The exception to that is if you are pregnant or become pregnant, and the first time you're exposed to this virus, because it can be transmitted sexually or through, usually it's sexual transmission or blood. If the first time you're exposed is when you become pregnant, it can cause developmental delays or other developmental defects for your child. So if you look, kind of fun fact, if you look on sperm donor websites, right, they'll list the donor is, such and such tall, and they have, this color eye, and they'll also have their CMV status, and they'll say positive or negative. Because again, it is possible that the woman is negative for CMV, and then if she receives a sperm donation from someone who is CMV positive, her child could be born with developmental delays or other sort of abnormalities because of that. So it's important to list, especially for those types of scenarios. Cool. This graph is just showing you the prevalence of exposure. So almost everybody has been exposed to the Epstein-Barr virus, which causes mono. By the time you reach your 20s, we're almost at 100%. And again, of this 100%, maybe only 10% or less will actually show symptoms. Turns out, it depends on your immune system and also the age at which you're exposed. So if you're exposed, I want to say anywhere from, here to here, probably here, you're going to be much more likely, maybe even here, to show symptoms of mono than someone who is infected later. CMV, approximately 90% of the population is positive. Really, the peak transmission occurs once you become sexually active. And then we have toxoplasma, which we'll talk about in a little bit. This guy is you get from cleaning out kidney litter. 40% of the population is positive for toxoplasma exposure. So again, I know that you've been exposed if I check your blood for antibodies and you have antibodies that react to toxoplasma. But not everybody is going to have active infections with toxoplasma. It just means you've been exposed. And this is interesting, toxo, because you get it from cats, and 40% of the population does not have a cat, right? It's a little bit less than that. So it's like, then how are you being exposed? So it's just interesting to consider. All right. Okay, so viral hemorrhagic fevers. So these are going to be fevers, usually with flu-like symptoms that are caused by viruses, that can, in certain individuals, cause hemorrhaging. Hemorrhaging is an uncontrolled bleeding. That can either look like a rash, similar to what we saw with Rocky Mountain spotted fever, where the blood vessels become leaky and you start to get red spots under the skin, or in really extreme circumstances, you can actually get blood coming from mucous membranes. So the membranes that surround your nasal passages and your eyes can actually start leaking blood. Again, flu-like symptoms are usually your initial symptoms, and then in extreme infections, uncontrolled bleeding from internal organs, nose, eyes, mouth. So pretty crazy. Most of these viruses are zoonotic, which means people get them from animals, not from other people, and most of them are transmitted to humans from the animals by mosquitoes. Okay, so again, kind of makes sense if you have the mosquito directly taking blood that's contaminated with the virus from one person and transmitting it to another. All right, so in the category of viral hemorrhagic fevers, we have a couple. Yellow fever. Yellow is describing the primary symptom of jaundice. This virus tends to damage your liver. Liver produces bile pigments and bilirubin, and when the liver stops functioning, those chemicals accumulate in the tissues of the body, giving you a slightly yellow color. It is spread by mosquitoes, normally found in monkeys. Most people who are exposed to yellow fever will just develop nausea, fever, headache, but it can cause severe liver damage and jaundice, and that's where the term yellow fever comes from. Dengue fever is also called break-bone fever. You get very painful joints in addition to the flu-like symptoms, also transmitted by mosquitoes, and it was, up until a few years ago, endemic in Florida. That means Florida you don't have to leave the country. If you live in Florida, there's a chance that you can pick up this condition. I should say this is the only hemorrhagic fever that you could potentially get without leaving the U.S. All of the other hemorrhagic fevers, you have to travel outside of the U.S. to be exposed. So again, extreme joint pain was probably a unique symptom, and also the fact that there have been some endemic cases. Not a ton, and I think that the risk has really decreased over the past few years, but it used to be endemic. Okay, Marburg or green monkey virus, vomiting blood. Marburg is the city in Germany where the virus outbreak occurred. Turns out they had some green monkeys at the zoo. The virus was transmitted to humans by mosquitoes. I wouldn't worry about that one too much. Lassa fever, transmitted in rodent urine. So they had a factory where some rodents urinated all over some food products. The urine contained virus, the virus for Lassa fever, and then there was an outbreak several years ago. And then Ebola is one that gets in the news a lot recently. A few years ago there was a big scare potentially about Ebola coming to the U.S. Normally found in fruit bat populations. It has an upwards of 90% mortality rate, and it's spread by contact with infected fluids. So this one's unique because it's not transmitted by mosquitoes, where the other ones are, except for Lassa fever. And in terms of risks to the U.S., Ebola is actually not considered highly contagious because in order for someone to spread Ebola, they have to actively look very ill, and you need to have direct contact with their contaminated bodily fluids. So their vomit, their sweat, their blood. This person looks very ill. So this is not going to be as contagious as something like measles, where someone can spread the disease, not look sick, not have the rash yet, and they can spread it. You don't have to touch them. It can just be through their breath. So not as potentially as contagious, but the problem is it's a hemorrhagic fever, so it's a really bad way to go, and it has a very high mortality rate as opposed to measles that has a much lower mortality rate, but it's much more likely to be transmitted. This is a video. CNN made a good 5-minute video walking through the basics of Ebola virus a few years ago when it was in the news. So if you're interested, feel free to have a view. All right, so that's it for viral diseases. Just some questions for thought. The answer to this one, although not a disease with an insect vector, why is Burkitt's lymphoma most commonly found in malarial areas? Malaria is transmitted by mosquitoes, and the answer to that is you're likely to develop Burkitt's lymphoma if you have malaria, and that just has to do with your immune system not functioning well because of the malaria. The second question, why is the mosquito Aedes albopictus a special concern to the population of temperate climates? So the answer to this is with climate change, this mosquito can go further and further north. So a lot of these hemorrhagic viruses, and we'll see a couple other diseases that we'll talk about in just a second, have the potential now to spread, from places like Florida up the coast to more northern latitudes as global warming happens. So that's a little bit of a concern. And then the last question, which disease does Ebola hemorrhagic fever more closely resemble? Lassa fever or hantavirus pulmonary syndrome? We didn't discuss hantavirus, so don't worry about this question. All right, so next up is protozoan diseases. We have Chagas disease, toxoplasmosis, malaria, leishmaniasis, and babiosis. Okay, Chagas disease is called American trypanosomiasis. So African trypanosomiasis, if you remember, was African sleeping sickness. So there is a closely related organism. Again, he looks kind of snake-like, Trypanosoma cruzii. He is transmitted to humans from rodents by the reduvid bug. This bug bites you by your lips, and then he poops by the bite, and then he rubs his poop in, and that's how you get trypanosomiasis. The reduvid bug is found in Central South America, so if you live in an area that doesn't have this bug, you're not going to have Chagas disease because there's no risk of exposure. Chagas disease can cause heart problems. That's why we talk about it in this section. So cardiac myopathy. Initial symptoms are going to be swelling of the cheek and eye. So if you can imagine, this little girl was probably bit around here, and then her body is going to react to that initial bite by swelling. And with that bite, she probably got some cyst deposited in her tissues, and then it develops into the full kind of snaky worm thing, and this guy can nestle in heart tissue and cause it to become damaged. Okay. Toxoplasmosis. This one is a big one. Toxoplasma. If you are pregnant or taking care of a pregnant woman, you want to tell her, do not clean the kitty litter. And the reason for that is to reduce her risk of getting toxoplasmosis. Toxoplasmosis is caused by a protozoan, Toxoplasma gondii. Normally, this parasite lives in cats, so it's a feline parasite normally. However, people come into contact with it when they clean out kitty litter, because the cats who are infected with this, it's present in their fecal matter. It's also possible for people to become infected with toxoplasma from eating undercooked meat, but as long as you're not eating meat that's raw, the risk from that is pretty minimal. The problem for pregnant women who contract toxoplasma is it can cause stillbirth of the child or neurological damage to the developing child. Both of those are pretty detrimental. So let's talk about what's happening in the cats. How did the cats get this? So what happens is actually it's carried in mice and birds. So if your cat is an outdoor cat and they like to kill mice and birds, there's a chance that by doing so, they are exposing themselves to toxoplasma. And there was an interesting study out a few years ago saying that mice infected with toxoplasma actually lose their fear of cat urine, so they're less fearful of cats, and also they have a slower reaction time. So of the mice that are present in the population, the mice infected with toxoplasma are going to be more likely to be taken by a cat, which is kind of cool. All right, so the cats are infected with toxoplasma, and then they release it in their fecal matter, and it's possible that grazing animals can consume the fecal matter accidentally, so that's how cows and pigs can become infected, so that's undercooked meat. But if your cat, who just killed the mouse, poops, there's a potential there for the toxoplasma to be in the fecal matter, and then you can, just make sure, as long as you're washing your hands, but there's a potential there for the pregnant woman to ingest it that way. So pregnant women should not be cleaning kitty litter, again, to reduce the risk of toxoplasma exposure. And if you are pregnant and you are exposed, can be pretty detrimental. If you have a strictly indoor cat, right, the risk of them being exposed to toxoplasma is greatly reduced. So I guess potentially you could still clean the kitty litter, but why would you volunteer to do that? Your husband doesn't need to know. You just don't clean the kitty litter. Okay. All right, on now to malaria. Malaria is caused by infection, so it's not a bacteria, it is a protozoan. So this guy has a nucleus, he's very smart. And different species of Plasmodium cause it. There's 4 main types of Plasmodium that can cause malaria. Plasmodium vivax, Plasmodium ovale, Plasmodium malariae, and Plasmodium falciparum. So Plasmodium falciparum is the most deadly. The good news is he's not the most common. So, give and you take. Mosquitoes are the most common vector, so you get malaria, from being bit by a mosquito who bit another person that had it. So again, transmitted to human, not by direct contact, but by mosquitoes. All right. Okay. So malaria lives inside human red blood cells. That's why we're discussing it in this chapter. It causes cyclical fevers that occur when the red blood cells explode, and these fevers occur every 24 to 48 hours. Sorry. hours. It's hard to write with a mouse. It depends. So if it's Plasmodium falciparum that's causing the infection, it'll be every 48 hours. But let's say if it's Vivax, it would be every 24 hours. So again, you get really intense flu-like symptoms, extreme fatigue, extreme achiness, and in addition to the high fevers, and they occur when the red blood cells that are all infected are exploding at once. You have a really severe immune reaction that results in the flu-like symptoms. There's currently no vaccine for this, so it's not preventable that way. The best ways to control your exposure at this point are insecticide-treated bed nets. There are prophylaxis drugs. So if you're traveling to an area that you know has endemic malaria, there are medications I can give you, like artemisinin. This is an example of a drug. So you would want to take this medication while you're traveling and when you come back, just to reduce your exposure. The good thing is if you do contract malaria, there are treatments, but the problem is there's drug resistance to those treatments. So again, reducing your risk of exposure to mosquitoes is one way to handle that. So again, this is an old map from 1912. So there used to be cases of malaria in the United States. It used to be endemic in America, but what happened was we had a really rigorous mosquito control program. DEET was used rather widely. The windows of our houses all have screens in them, so really we reduce the risk of exposure, and then you can break the transmission cycle. So if you don't have any people that have active malaria in these areas, even though you still might have mosquitoes, you're not gonna, if you eliminate people that have malaria from these areas, you stop transmission. This is showing you the transmission cycle. So you're bit by a mosquito. In the saliva of the mosquito are the parasites. The parasites first go to the liver of the person, and then from there they hop into the bloodstream. And then in the bloodstream, they go through a series of life cycle changes where the red blood cells explode every so often, again, every 24 to 48 hours. And then this person needs to be bit by a mosquito again. And then once they're bit by a mosquito, the cycle can repeat itself. All right. Malaria still results in over 500,000 deaths a year. Most of them are children. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation puts a lot of money into malaria prevention. Turns out sleeping with a bed net, just sleeping with something around you that mosquitoes can't penetrate, actually really reduces your risk. And mosquitoes lay their eggs in water, so reducing standing water has also been shown to help. Okay. Babyosis is a disease like malaria in that the parasite lives inside of red blood cells. It's transmitted by ticks, not mosquitoes, and you get this from mice. So mice are bit by ticks, and then the ticks bite you, and then the protozoan goes to live in your blood. Similar symptoms to Lyme's disease. Lyme's disease, because it's caused by a bacteria, you would give antibiotics. For babyosis, you would have to give a different medication because this is not a bacteria, this is a protozoan. So kind of interesting. As we're going through these conditions, also one of the main types of questions I like to ask, is this caused by a bacteria? Is this caused by a protozoan? So just make sure that the diseases that we have been discussing in this portion of the lecture, you guys are aware are protozoan, and that the viruses are viruses, and bacteria are bacteria. Leishmaniasis is a disease caused by an infection with Leishmania parasites. You don't need to know this information. I'm not going to ask you. It is transmitted by insects, sandflies. So if you don't live in areas where they have sandflies, you're, good to go. And this so depending on how this enters your body, you can get a different set of symptoms. So this is cutaneous leishmaniasis. So there was a question on the skin quiz about leishmaniasis. What what type of organism is it? And so it's a protozoan, and the reason why he, that question was in the skin section was because he does cause a skin lesion. So cutaneous means skin, so this guy was bit by sand flea, and then it caused this ulcerative lesion. Why we're talking about him now is that he can also cause a fatal condition, attacking the cardiovascular, nervous, and heart systems in some cases. All right, and now for our last disease of the cardiovascular system, helminthic diseases, or the parasitic worm disease, and we're going to talk about schistosomiasis. So schistosomiasis is a disease caused by an infection with a parasitic worm called schistosoma. And this guy is unique because he requires freshwater snails to complete his life cycle. So the malaria parasite needs a mosquito, right? And schistosomiasis or schistosomas require freshwater snails as part of their life cycle. It causes swimmer's itch. There's a picture in a second that will explain that a little bit. But basically, this right here is the parasitic worm. And this is showing you the swimmer's itch. So this swimmer's itch, or these little breaks here, are actually not what we saw with Rocky Mountain spotted fever. So with Rocky Mountain spotted fever, we had the blood vessels that were leaking blood, and so these were kind of like little bruises under the skin. But in this case, what you're actually seeing is these parasitic worms are actually burrowing through the skin. The freshwater snail lives in water. He releases the worms into the water, and then as you go swimming, right, so this guy's probably walking through a pond or something, the parasitic worms burrow in through his skin, and these are very itchy, so that is swimmer's itch. The reason why we discuss it in this section is because the parasitic worm's eggs travel in your circulation and can embed in your tissues, causing granulomas to form in the various tissues of the body. This infographic, I think, shows it kind of nicely, where you have, and then it's spread in your fecal matter or your urine. So someone who has this parasitic worm poops or pees in your fresh water, and then the worms mature in freshwater snails. And then the freshwater snails release a form that can burrow in through your skin, causing swimmer's itch, and then they go from your skin into your intestinal tract, and then to your kidneys, where you excrete them, and the cycle starts over again. Cool. All right, so that's it for the cardiovascular system. There will be a quiz covering this material due before class on Tuesday, posted on Blackboard. And if you have any questions or need any clarification, please feel free to email me. All right,